It's time for Drummer Nation. John Ramsey began playing drums at the age of 10. He went on to study with jazz greats Joe Morrello, Max Roach, and Alan Dawson. He served a 2-year stint as the second drummer for Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. He was one of the first teachers at the renowned Berklee College of Music, where he developed a holistic teaching philosophy which presents music as an avenue for students to discover their own humanity and form a happy life. John recently retired from Berklee. He's authored several method books and continues to be active on the jazz scene. Memphis Drum Shop is the world's premier provider of percussion instruments. With 6 showrooms of gear, mycymbal.com, the Memphis Gong Chamber, and a first-rate repair department, turn to Memphis Drum Shop for all your percussion needs.
Our latest innovation has opened the door for all drummers to have the same access as top musicians in the world. Custom cymbals. Now available to everyone. Your next sound just got more interesting. Sabian Custom Shop.
Welcome to another edition of Drummer Nation, where my guest today is my pal John Ramsey, and I will let him fill us in a little bit on some bio stuff, but I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about that. We like to get right to drums and drumming. So welcome, John. Thank you for doing my show.
Hello, Michael, and let me just say what an honor to be a part of Drummer Nation. You do a great service with this, and you do a great job. So it's my pleasure, and I'm really humbled to be here. So thank you.
I appreciate that. So I read a little bit about your bio. I was surprised to see you started like at 10 years old or something, but just playing rock and roll, right?
Yeah, more like probably 12 or 13, but I think probably the interest was there at the age of 10. So I'll try to give you the short version. I grew up in a small town in the western part of Massachusetts on the Vermont border, next to a dairy farm. I had cows in the backyard and everything that goes along with that. But my mom actually worked in a nightclub, the only one in town. So I was exposed to some early rock music there, live music, and I had a couple of friends who both owned drum sets, but I didn't have a drum set. But whenever I went over their house, I would want to play their drums, and they would want to play, War or whatever. So,
let me ask you something there. When you said, when I was a kid, my cousins played, and I sat down at their drum set, and I knew, like in a second, like, wow, I got to do this. Did you have that kind of feeling?
I think on some level, absolutely. Yeah. I knew it was something that would take hold, and absolutely. But long story short, some older friends, actually in my sister's class, had a band in those days. So we're talking really like 1962, right? Or thereabouts. And so I would go to, this is one of my friends who actually, the other one who had the set of drums, Dave Sr. was his name. And so I would go to their band rehearsals and kind of just sit around. And then when they took a break, I would jump up and play his drums, right? The annoying younger kid from the neighborhood. So, but at any rate, these guys were going to play in a Battle of the Bands, which was a big thing back in those days, a local Battle of the Bands in Greenfield, Massachusetts. Look that up on the map. And the drummer wanted to sing a song, but he couldn't sing and play at the same time. So they said, well, you go up to the microphone, we'll let Ramsey jump up on the drums, and then, he'll come out and you'll sing and he'll play, and then he'll go back and you'll go back. So that was kind of the beginning for me. And what actually happened was these guys came in second, and the local hometown band came in first. And the drummer, Dave Sr., who was so upset, I can still see this in my mind's eye today, well, it's like 50 years later. He was so upset. He took his sticks, he threw them into the tray of the trap case, and he said, "That's it, I quit."
Didn't take
and
much.
he really quit. He never played drums again for, if at all, for a very long time. And so there I was, instant band, instant employment, instant income, maybe $10, something like that.
All you had to do was learn how to play.
Yeah, I mean, because these guys already had gigs. They were playing, teen dances and the Moose Club, and and so I was instantly a professional drummer, so to speak. And you're right, I was all self-taught at that point. It was the early period of rock and roll, or at least mid-early. I think it was probably Beatles by then. I don't remember when they came out, but it was maybe been before them. I think the song that I played, that I came out on the stage and played for Dave when he sang, was Mellow Yellow. Do you remember that song? I don't know if that's Donovan or the Kinks or somebody like that. You got it. You're showing your age.
I know.
So
it wasn't straight eights, though, right? I think it was a shuffle.
Yeah, I think you're right. Absolutely. Yeah, so that's how I started. And of course, these guys, I was in this band playing rock all by ear for at least 10 years with different sort of configurations. We had a booking agent in Keene, New Hampshire, so we played all the colleges, Dartmouth College, University of Vermont, all the frat houses. Now, when you're a 13, 14-year-old kid, you see what goes on in a frat house. You get an education real quick.
Yeah.
And so, for 10 years I played in that band, and pretty much all by ear. I took a couple lessons, I should confess, with a guy named Joe Sefcik. Do you know who Joe Sefcik was? Joe Sefcik was Joe Morello's teacher.
Really?
Yeah, Joe Sefcik, it's I think Sefjic, but Joe Sefcik taught in Holyoke, Massachusetts, which was right next to Springfield. And of course, Joe Morello was from Springfield, Mass. And I remember the story. I think I had 2 or 3 lessons, me and a buddy. We went to see Joe Sefcik. The story I remember Joe Sefcik telling us about Morello was that, Joe was losing his sight even at a very early age.
Right.
And so Sefcik told us that, Joe would come into his lesson, and I'm going to use this prop and he said Joe would pick up a piece of music and he would do that, right? Because he could see a little with those big Coke bottle glasses. He'd put down the music, he'd play the whole page from memory. So that's my Joe Morello, Joe Sefcik story. So I took a couple lessons from Joe. His thing was all about 3 stick heights, like 3 inches, 7 inches, and then a full stroke, which we all know about now is upstrokes and downstrokes.
Right.
But I mean, that was it for me as far as education until about, let's see, if it was 10 years later, let's say that was 1962 up to about 1972, 1973, I was playing with a kind of an early funk fusion band with guys who were from around the UMass Amherst area, Amherst, Massachusetts, which is really a 5-college area. You had UMass, you had Amherst College, you had Smith College in Northampton, you had Hampshire College, and then, Mount Holyoke? So anyways, it was a very kind of hip scene and area. So I ended up playing with some guys in a band down there, and a couple of them were actually enrolled at the University of Massachusetts at a time when Max Roach was there. And Archie Shep came, Reggie Workman was teaching there. And now I was just a local kid who played with some of the guys who were actually officially enrolled in the classes, but I would go to their classes. I would go to the big band rehearsal, and the drummer for that was John Betch. If you know John, he's been living in Paris for many years, but John Betch was the official enrolled drummer in the UMass Jazz Workshop big band. But I would sit behind John and try to reconcile what he played with what was on the written page, because I couldn't read music. And lo and behold, when John had a gig or something, I was tapped to sub for him in the big band. And of course, all I had was my ears, and I knew very little about jazz at that point. But Fred Tillis, who was the director of the jazz program there at that time, was very kind and gracious to me. I owe him a lot, actually. I remember when he took me into his office and started writing out quarter notes and quarter rests for me. But but this was what led to me being in some of Max Roach's classes. He had an ensemble. Now, Max never taught private lessons. I'll tell you that story in a minute. But he had a percussion ensemble. You know, the first day we all did this, right? You remember Boom, his percussion ensemble.
Yeah, I saw them.
They would open up with that. But Max had a history of jazz class, which really was him telling Charlie Parker stories.
Mm-hmm.
He had a percussion ensemble, and then he had one or two small group ensembles. And of course, he let me play in those. There was a great drummer, Royal Hardigan. I don't know if you know Royal. He's an amazing musician, great piano. Plays piano in the 70s. He played piano like McCoy Tyner, and Max Roach would come into the ensemble and give the sticks to Royal and tell Royal to play the hi-hat. And Royal had all that hi-hat fanning stuff that, you know, you see Max and Roy Haynes do.
Papa
and,
Joe, yeah.
Yeah, and so I was like the local kid, right? And at some point I approached Max. I said, Mr. Roach, do you give private lessons? And Max shook his head. He said, no, Ramsey, I don't do that. He said, but if you want to study, you should get your behind down to Boston and find Alan Dawson. And that's what prompted and led to me seeking out Alan. And I want to say 1972, 73, could have been even 1974, at which point I would have been about the age of 24 at the time. I was born in 1950. So, yeah, that would have been early 70s.
Well, you started at the top. I mean, that's you can't find a better teacher than Dawson.
Absolutely.
Good for you.
And at that time, of course, Alan lived in the house that I'm speaking to you from now, but that's beside the point. But this was 90 miles away from Amherst or Western Mass where I was living. So I would drive 180 miles round trip every other week to come and take my lesson with Alan. Yeah. So at least when I was, you know, consistent. I wasn't a great student, by the way. I was very slow to really rise to the challenge. But the irony of that is that it'd be another 10 years later, or maybe even more, around 1984, 86, I was already teaching at Berklee at that point, and I started to, you know, I was still not the greatest chart interpretation guy in the world. So I sought out Ed Sof, who was 90 miles or 100 miles back in the other direction in Wethersfield, Connecticut, at Bob Gatson's studio, right? So I sought out Ed Sof, and I started to do the reverse, you know, 200-mile round trip.
Another great teacher.
I'm telling you, I'm so blessed to have had the guys in my life that I had. You know, and I was thinking about it today. It really was all born out of me being really a very curious kid and wanting, really being hungry for all the drum knowledge that I could.
Don't you think you have to have that? You got to have that, man.
Absolutely. You gotta be thirsty. You gotta want it. And, you know, it led me to Max. It led me to Alan. It led me to Ed, you know. It was really, you know, it led me to Art Blakey, you know, close up, you know. And so absolutely the you know, the thirst for knowledge, and I guess you, as you know, education has been a big part of my life. But
right.
Yeah, so three very, you know, significant guys in my career: Max Roach, Alan Dawson, Ed Sof.
Hello, everyone. My name is David Victor. I'm General Manager with the Craviato Drum Company. We wanted to offer a one-ply, solid shell product, but we wanted it to stay true to our mission of offering handmade drums of uncompromised quality built here in the USA. So take a listen to our Center Stage Series drum set.
So having had so many great teachers, let's talk about them for a bit. First of all, one thing I've always said about Ed, he's a friend of mine, is that he's had so many great players come through his studio, if you want to call it that, and none of them sound like each other, and none of them sound like Ed, which to me is a great compliment to a teacher.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And the litany of great players is his record, that any teacher would be proud to stand on. But I want to ask you about Alan Dawson's, first of all. For guys who don't know, for younger kids, tell us about Alan Dawson and what was different about him, and what made him such a great teacher and player.
Yeah. Well, you might know this, but many people may not. Alan actually was the first, and for a while, the only drum instructor at Berklee, in those days, Berklee School of Music. I don't even think they called it Berklee College yet, but Alan was the first teacher, the first drum set, and the only teacher there for a while. There's a great interview online with him and, I'm going to forget his name, but maybe it'll come to me, where he talks about his early days. But I think he had already established himself as one of the first call, not only drummers in Boston, but in internationally. Because, again, some people may not know that, well, of course, he played with Lionel Hampton Big Band. He was the house drummer for Prestige Records for a while, too. So he's on a lot of records with Dexter Gordon and, Jackie Byard. And, I mean, you'll see in the book that I was the scribe for, his discography. But he had played with Lionel Hampton. But more significantly, he was the drummer who took Joe Morello's place in the Dave Brubeck Band. And there's lots of video on YouTube of Alan playing with Brubeck.
And that was one of the biggest jazz bands in the world at the time. I mean, Brubeck was on the cover of Time.
Absolutely. Back to those days when I was a kid with my two best friends who were also drummers. We had this video, well, it wasn't video then, but this amusement arcade where we used to go, where they had a jukebox, and Take 5 was a hit record. It was on the jukebox, the first ever with a drum solo. And so, Brubeck was just, I mean, he was huge.
People forget he was hip. He was so hip, the college crowd embraced him. And that was back when people would argue over whether or not you could play jazz in anything other than 4/4. Right. So he did Time Out, and it was all these odd time signatures, and pretty much established, you can play jazz in any meter. Yeah. But it was a hit.
Absolutely. Big hit. So Alan was, I think, probably in the band, in Brubeck's band, longer than Morello was, but I'm not certain about the recordings he might have done with Brubeck, but I know there are tons of videos if you Google them up on YouTube. So Alan was already, a world famous player.
Right.
Before he became a teacher. Of course, Alan would talk about having studied with, I think he would always say his main teacher, I think, was a guy named Charlie Alden, if I'm not mistaken. But he also studied with George L. Stone, right? The stick control fame in Boston, in the Boston area. Yeah. So I guess probably like a lot of us, he came to education as a player who, found value in being able to stay home rather than spend his entire life on the road. And he actually told me that on occasion. He and I were in, I think somewhere in it might have been Stockholm in Sweden, and there was a jazz festival there. And so he and I were hanging out in the jam session in the hotel, ballroom or whatever in the evening. And do you know about Vinny Ruggiero? Vinny Ruggiero. He was a Philly Joe Jones understudy, I guess you could say, but he had also studied with Alan. And I remember I was standing there with Alan, and Vinny Ruggiero, who sounded almost exactly like Philly Joe, was playing in the jam session. And Alan and I were chatting, and Alan said, he said, that's why I've lived my life the way I have as a teacher. And, one of the lasting lessons I got from Alan was when I used to come to this house in Lexington, Massachusetts, right? A suburb of Boston. It's, the famous Lexington where the shot heard round the world. It's a pretty affluent neighborhood, right? But one of the first things that struck me when I pulled up in the driveway of this house was I thought because I was a kid playing in nightclubs and bars for, with bands that if we had a good week, we made $90 each, right? That was a good week for us. Hey, it made $90, we're playing for the door or whatever. But when I pulled up to this house, it just dawned on me that, wow, you can be a musician, you can be a drummer and still have a normal life with a decent house and a car and so that was a lesson from Alan. But I remember standing with him at that jam session, and he said, if being on the road was like this all the time, then I would do it. I wouldn't mind it. He said, but it's not like this all the time. It was a decent hotel. It was a great festival. We were well taken care of. And he said, that's why I choose to do what I do, which is, I think maybe you could have said in those days, teacher first and player second. I mean, he played a lot, but he was the first call guy in Boston. So anybody that came to Boston, from Johnny Hartman to Major Holly or any of these jazz guys that came, Sonny Stitt, call Alan, right? So, but that was I think that was his insight into the life of being a musician, where you have enough control over your career and education to have that control that you can kind of pick and choose what you did. So that's something about Alan many people may not realize.
Let me bring up another point, which you've sort of touched on, is that, nowadays there's 1,000 books out there and 10,000 videos. And back then there wasn't really a drum set pedagogy.
No.
So not only was he a dedicated educator and a great player, they were making up this teaching techniques and, pedagogy as they went and established some stuff that's still taught today.
Well, that was Alan's, I think, his genius. He had musical concepts that he was able to create exercises for. I'll give you a quick example, and it's all in the book. Being able to solo and follow song form. So he used the stick control book in a way that you would interpret those right-left stickings for the drum set. In other words, rights equals alternating hands on the snare drum, lefts equal the bass drum. And he conceived of, I used to imagine Alan like lying awake at night and just, thinking like, how can I get this concept
But
across?
I still teach those exercises, don't you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then, of course, he became known for having, over 40 ways of interpreting those 8 pages in the syncopation, the Ted Reed syncopation book, right? Starting with snare drum plays the line, and then bass drum plays the line, and short notes on the snare drum, long notes on the bass drum. And, I remember Alan saying to me once, I said, so that book, Syncopation, that's a really, really big book. He said, yeah, mostly thanks to me. so, I mean, these were like, really strokes of genius to me. And everybody knows a lot of those 40 ways now, the left hand filling a triplet, tom-tom short, cymbal and bass drum long, alternating triplets, short notes, accent.
I learned it in the 70s at North Texas State. At the time it was called that. And I still teach it nowadays. It's great stuff.
Yep. I think it's fair enough to say that most of them are attributable to Alan. It was really, I think, his genius that came up with those ideas. So I remember a kid when I was teaching at Berklee who came to my office once, and he had 3 or 4 pages of 120 different ways of interpreting syncopation. So, they've been expounded on. A lot of them were Alan's, but there were others that, I'd never seen before. So I think that was Alan's unique genius, of creating exercises that reinforced musical. And he would say that, he designed his lessons to be 50% technique and 50% music.
That was my next question, because you have to have both. I went up through the schools and learned all the exercises. Then I studied with Jeff Hamilton, and he said, let's try to make a musician out of you. You learned all that stuff.
Yep.
The independence and all, that's something you have to get through. But that's puts you at page 1 of becoming a musician, right?
Yeah. Well, that was, I think, very much the case of that exercise we're talking about, where you would have to sing a variety of melodies of various song forms. So you would start in the first column of stick control with an AABA 32-bar tune, right?
Mm-hmm.
Most common song form there is. Then once you got past that, and boy, to sing the melody aloud while you're playing through those exercises and then play a chorus of solo, still singing aloud was a major hurdle for many of us, and still is for a lot of my students.
Well,
but
because we naturally can machine gun, we can play a ton of notes. The melodies make you stop to breathe.
Yeah, that's right. And they make you think melodically and
Mm-hmm.
harmonically, really.
Mm-hmm.
But after you got done with the AAB exercise, you'd go to the second column of stick control with an ABAC tune, tunes like Four or On Green Dolphin Street. And then the next column with the ABAB, those are tunes like Sunny or Blue Bossa. But those were the 3 32-bar song forms. And then the next column on page 6, he would have you do a 12-bar tune, most of which are blues. And then it's funny that he didn't start with the blues, but then you'd go to page 7, column 1, with a 48-bar tune. And there aren't many of those. It's like I'll Remember April, Night and Day. The Night Has 1,000 Eyes. I think maybe Old Devil Moon. So there aren't very many. So they were kind of in descending order of commonality or whatever. Once you reach that point, and that could take months depending on the kind of student you were, right? Once you hit that page 7, stick control, the second column, he would say, okay, pick any tune. And you would keep going through that book. So you were learning repertoire. I mean, I have an old copy of the book downstairs. I look in there and I see some of the tunes. So I had to learn tunes. So, that was really a genius stroke for Alan. And like you said, really enforced the musicality side of it. But
you play piano too, right?
I play piano badly, but it was another great teacher of mine that, I've always sang. I've been in bands where I was both the lead singer and the drummer, which is another story again. But I've always wanted to be able to sing and accompany myself on piano. So many years ago, I engaged with a teacher named Charlie Bonakis, there are more famous musicians. Danilo Perez is a great example, who all studied with Charlie. Charlie was like, the story about Charlie was that Miles Davis called him one night and wanted to study with him. And Charlie thought it was his friend Jerry Bergonzi playing a joke on him. So he hung up on Miles. But Charlie was an amazing, amazing piano player and teacher.
Well, I'll bring it up in the context of you being a musician and learning songs and song form and changes and all that stuff, which makes... Now, when you were teaching in the early days, was it a lot of the stuff you got from Alan?
It was all of the stuff I got from Alan. Later, some of the stuff I got from Ed, too. Mm-hmm. But, of course, there was a little Art Blakey mixed in there because I'd just come off of 2 years with Art Blakey. But
let's go to that. Tell me the Blakey thing.
Let me tell you one other thing about the Alan thing, because you asked. Go ahead. But everything I taught of Alan's, I would write out by hand, right? Until at one point I learned to use Xeroxing. I'd write it once and then Xerox the page. But Alan gave 4 things in every lesson. He gave you rudiments. He gave you an exercise with the stick control book that had to do with a single stroke roll. So you would move metronome markings each time you made a certain speed for your singles.
Right.
And then he had the 4-way coordination exercise that I mentioned with the syncopation book, and then the song form exercise using stick control. So those were the 4 things, the meat and potatoes of Alan's teaching. And of course, that was an hour lesson. When I started at Berklee, they were 30-minute lessons and only 30-minute lessons. It's changed now, but I would cram all of that stuff into a 30-minute lesson, or at least try to. Mm-hmm. But, the students are what really inspired the book, because they'd go, man, this is great stuff. Is this written down anywhere? And I go, yeah, well, I mean,
you wrote
in your notes. Yeah.
Well, talk about the book.
I had already a lot of people don't realize this was my first book, which has the very original title of Art Blakey's Jazz Messages. But so I had already had, through Rob and Paul at the time, the Drummers Collective, I had a publishing, connection. Mm-hmm. At that time, they were called Manhattan Music, and then of course Manhattan Music became CPV Bellwin, I think, and then Warner Brothers. So the students kind of inspired me to reach out to Alan and say, "Hey, Alan, the kids they all want this stuff." And I said, "Have you ever thought about writing a book?" And he had already written a book. He had an Odd Times book that was published in Germany. And I remember at one point saying to him, "Well, I never knew you had a book." He was sour on publishing, right? I said, "I never knew you had a book." He said, "Exactly." So when I approached him, I said, "Well, I got this Art Blakey book, and if I have your blessing, I'd love to write, your method." And he said yes. He said, "Okay, you write it. I'll proof it or edit it or whatever." And it was only a few months after he agreed to let me do the book, really to be the scribe, that he was diagnosed with leukemia. And so he never lived to see the result. But of course, I went to his wife and I said, "Alan and I were working on his book. Do I have your blessing to go ahead, follow through and have it published?" So it was again, Rob and Paul, thanks to them that the book exists. But both the Blakey and the Dawson estate get a portion of the royalties. But
I absolutely love playing drums, and I couldn't imagine not having that in my life. And I really, if I could help facilitate that and have an impact on your life so that you can play drums, that means the world to me.
So my affiliation with Art Blakey lasted for, I guess, a little over 2 years. But the way it started is an interesting story because around 1979, when I was actually officially enrolled in the music department at UMass Amherst, at that time, my roommate was a piano player by the name of Bruce Sklar. And he was friends with Art Blakey's son, who lived up, of all places, in Waitsfield, Vermont, which is he lived right at the foot of a very well-known ski resort, Sugarbush. So Gamal Buhena was friends with a guy in town, a very ski resorty kind of town. It was a guy in town who owned a really kind of a high-class art gallery / French restaurant. He had art on the first floor and then a French restaurant, of course, with art on the second floor, kind of like an old barn in the center of Waitsfield, Vermont. So David, I can't remember his last name, but at any rate, he wanted to start bringing New York jazz artists up to Vermont. God, his name just flew by. Anyways, so one of the guys he brought up from New York was Sonny Stitt. Now, Sonny Stitt never traveled with the rhythm section. It was always a pickup band for him, right? But because Art Blakey's son knew Bruce at UMass, he called Bruce to say, "Hey, can you put together a rhythm section for Sonny Stitt? He's going to play for 2 weeks." And of course, Bruce tapped me to be the drummer, and Santi Debriano, a great bass player, who I met for the first time. Then I think Santi lived in Boston at that time. But so myself, Bruce Sklar, and Santi Debriano became the rhythm section for Sonny Stitt. And we were going to lodge at Gamal Buhena's house because he had kind of I don't know what to call it, an outhouse, a cabin next to the main house.
An outbuilding.
Yeah. And so this is how I met our son Gamal. In fact, I don't know, the first or second night that we played with Stitt, he said, "You remind me of my father." And, I'm fairly early on in my pursuit of jazz, right? At that point, I've been studying with Alan maybe 3 or 4 years. But anyway, I looked at him like, "Well, I think you're crazy, but thanks a lot,
Thanks. Yeah.
I don't know what reminds you of your father, but long story short, we did that gig. It was a great gig. Sonny Stitt was at his peak because he had Sonny Stitt had a terrible drinking problem that plagued him up until he died. But at that point, he'd been sober for several months because he had fallen and hit his head. And he told us then, he said, I had to learn to tie my shoes all over again. But he was playing his behind off. I mean, that was like amazing. But anyways, I go back to my little gigs around Amherst, Mass, Northampton, Mass, and back to UMass. And a few months later, I get a call from Gamal Buhena, who says, my father's putting a big band together, and he wants to use 2 drummers, and I want you to audition. I was like, okay.
Wow. Yeah.
So I said, well, who else is auditioning?
You don't want to know that. You don't want to ask that question.
He goes, Michael Carvin and Keith Copeland. Now, these were 2 cats who were already established, right? Keith had played with Stevie Wonder. His dad was Ray Copeland, the famous jazz trumpeter.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, Michael Carvin. I saw Michael Carvin play with, what was his name? The blind
Rasan?
saxophonist, Rasan Roland Kirk. I saw Carvin with him.
Carvin did my show.
And, great guy.
Yeah.
I love Michael. He's a great guy. So immediately, I'm in panic mode. I'm like, well, I'll audition, but, I don't hold out much hope of getting the gig with those guys, competing with those.
You never know.
Anyway, you never know. A couple of days later, Gamal calls me back. He says, what's your passport number? Now, the strange part of that is that when I played with Stitt, he kind of, he said something. It was actually when we played with him before the gig, he played a clinic at UMass, and I was in the rhythm section that played behind him for, the clinic he did. And he was probably drunk at the time, but at one point he turned around and started playing, facing me, and he said, I'm going to take you to Africa, boy. And I'm looking at the piano player, and I'm saying, what did he say? And he's like, you want to go to Africa? So, immediately I'm seeing my new career flash before my eyes. I'm going off to Africa to play with Sonny Stitt, and I've made it, right?
See, when you said that, I thought musically you were going to go to Africa. He meant he's taking you on the road to Africa.
That's what I thought. I think I'm going to take you to Africa with me. I'm
thinking Daningo or something,
Yeah, no. But anyway, it turned out to be, a kind of a drunken Sonny Stitt statement, but it inspired me to go out and get a passport. So when Gamal called and said, what's your passport number? I think I'd probably just gotten the passport the month before. I said, well, hold on a second. It's in the other room. Let me go give you the number.
You had it.
I give him the passport number. He goes, what's your shirt size? And I'm like, well, such and such. What's your jacket size? I said, well, I don't know, but why?
Yeah, what, are we getting married?
He said, you still have to audition, but my father is drugged with the other cats because they're asking for too much money. Drug, right? He's drugged with the cats. I'm like, okay, my heart's probably beating up. At any rate, a few weeks later,
some people forget that maybe the young guy gets a break because he's hungry, because he's willing to work for whatever bread there is, because he is willing to take instruction. He's dying for that opportunity, whereas an older player could be more troublesome or not available.
Money was the last thing on my mind.
Right.
I don't even know if I found out how much the gig paid until we were on the plane or something. But
that story, Erskine was with Stan Kenton as a young kid, and one time they're in the elevator together, and he can tell the story better than me, but I think Stan says, we haven't talked about money yet, and Peter says, oh yeah, how much do you need? Like he was willing to pay to be on the band,
Yeah.
So
I think I might have heard that on your show. Maybe.
Oh, okay. Peter might have said it. Yeah.
Yeah. But anyways, off I go to New York to the Black Bean Rehearsal Studios, which was owned by, do you know Dom Ramau, if I'm saying his name, Brazilian drummer?
Yeah.
He earned a rehearsal / performance space in New York, and so I drive down. It's a dark studio, but I open the door. I go in, and there's a drum set on the left side of the stage, and then standing around are Billy Pierce, Branford Marcellus, Wynton Marcellus. Of course, they're like 18 and 19 years old at the time, right? Nobody had quite heard of them yet. Kevin and Robin Eubanks were also there in the band. Valery Ponomarev, the Russian trumpet player. Charles Fambro was the bass player. James Williams on piano, and
Young Lions.
I'm not who I'm leaving. I don't know who I'm leaving up. But anyways, they're
Trombone.
up there. Bobby Watson.
Oh, Bobby, yeah, I went to college with him.
Robin Eubanks was the trombone
That's
player.
right. You said that.
So I kind of slink in the back and I sit down at a table, right? And because I'm going to listen. And Bobby Watson goes, "Are you John?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And he goes, "Okay, well, Art will be here in a little bit," or something like that. So I'm sitting there, I'm listening to these guys. They're playing Wheel Within a Wheel. It's a waltz. So I'm listening, I'm getting kind of the gist of the tune, right? And I'll never forget, the door blows open, and standing in the door is this little small in stature. Art was like 5'2", 3", something like that. His shadow filled the door with the sunlight coming in from behind him, and the first words out of his mouth were, "Where's John?" So,
Here I am.
I'm here. And he goes, "John, get up there and play. Don't you worry about a thing. You're with me now. You have arrived." So I'm like, okay. And this is all, look, I'm a little kid from the cow town, right? The dairy farm, right?
Yeah, but he's
Pretty
nurturing.
much.
He's nurturing. He's not saying, "Sit down, kid. One mistake and you're out."
Oh no, he was the king of nurture. We could say that almost. But so I get up, and now there's his son Gamal, who was the road manager, and his buddy David Bardis were bringing in Art's drums and setting them up next to the other drum set, right? So now I'm up on the house kit, and I'm playing the waltz that I've been listening to, and there was no music. Nobody wrote drum charts for Art Blakey's band, right? The other guys had music, but I'm playing the tune, and Art's kind of, watching the guy set up his drum. He's kind of nodding his head like, yeah, okay, yeah, you kind of know what you're doing. But he was very supportive. He repeated that same line. Once he had his drum set up, he said, "Don't worry about a thing. You're with me now. You have arrived. He said, if you make a mistake, make it loud. So you never make." So he was that kind of, as you said, nurturing kind of father figure, really, until the next tune, which he said, "All right, Bobby." Bobby was the musical director. "What are we doing?" And so Bobby called this tune called ETA, which had a tempo about like this.
Quarter note equals 300, yeah.
Yeah, or more like 350.
Yeah.
Because I actually clocked it because there's a transcription, because I was taping that. I was taping that rehearsal. So now Art starts off that tune with his opening drum solo, and I come in, and I think I probably went 2 choruses, and then I was like, my right rigor mortis set in, and it was like, and I was scuffling. And after that, it didn't phase him in the least bit. He laid into me. He was like, "If you have to stop, just stop. I'll take it." And so anyways, that's my first,
trial by fire.
And this is a big band. This was a big band with 2 drummers. And, people would say, "Well, Art, why do you have 2 drums?" Art would say, "Well, if 2 horn players can play together, 2 drummers can play together." And so that, he had already had a big band. I think it was maybe the 13 Messengers that made an album maybe in the 50s or 60s.
Well, he went back with big bands to Billy Eckstein.
Yeah, actually Fletcher Henderson before Billy. Yeah. So anyways, that started my tenure first as the second drummer in the big band. I have to tell you about the night where there was 3 drummers. It was me, Art, and Kenny Clark in Italy. But after that, and I always say it was about a 6-week tour of Europe, that big band tour. It may not have been that long, but it seemed that long. I mean, we went everywhere. Started in Norway, to Sweden, to Denmark, to Italy, and multiple dates in each country, right? Germany, Spain, France. And so it was quite a grueling tour. And a lot of times we were on a bus. I remember Winton and Branford, growling about some of the accommodations sometimes. They were young kids, but I was 30 at the time. But after that big band tour, I went back to Northampton, Mass, and my little gigs, of course, now I'm playing Art Blakey tunes, right? Around Northampton and UMass Amherst. And, I'm the band leader now. But, a couple months later, I get this call from Art, and he goes, "John, I need you to go to Europe with me. Gamal is up there in Vermont, and I can't find him anywhere." Now, Gamal didn't want to be found after road managing the big band tour. See, he didn't really grow up around Art because, the parents were divorced, and Art was always, of course. But this big band tour was Gamal's first, I would say, long-term exposure to Art. And after that, Gamal wanted to, he's a Vermonter at heart. He didn't want to be found. So Art called me, asked me to go to Europe with him. And, now I'm the road manager. And so that tenure with Art lasted at least a couple of years. And really, that was where I was able to kind of transcribe. I heard him play 5-6 nights a week. Right. Sometimes I subbed, sometimes I was a rehearsal drummer. And that's where the genesis of the book was. I had little notebooks where I would notate things, thanks to Alan Dawson now, right, that Art played. And but it was like good 2 years up close with Art Blakey.
Wow. How long did it take to where you felt like you were one of the guys and you belonged there?
Oh, God. Well, in the big band, we had this young 17, 18-year-old Whitney and Branford, and then Robin and Kevin. And, those guys were still in the phase of life where they did what I guess you call calling the dozens. Right. Right. Or
that's a New Orleans term, the dozens. It's insulting one another.
Yeah, we called it ranking out each other in the junior high that I went to, but they were still into that. So I had some issues to overcome, in the big band, and then as a road manager, you're a low man on the totem pole for road manager. So there was some abuse at the hands of some unnamed members. A lot of time all in fun and just to break the tedium of the 12-hour drive from New York to Fort Lauderdale. Well, it's probably more like 20 hours, but yeah, I mean, in the end, nobody wanted me to leave. Art above all is, I remember Winton saying to me, "Ramsey, please don't go, because I was always threatening to leave because I wasn't playing and I really wanted to play, and every time I would do it, like I remember going up to the elevator in the Blackstone Hotel in Chicago with Art, and I was like, "Art, I got to get back to playing. I got to leave. I got to go." He said, "John," this is how he would get you, "John, you stay right where you are. The important thing is to have the information."
Well, he had a point.
And of course, now he had me hooked for another 6 months.
Yeah, but he did have a point. I mean, that was Art Blakey you were watching every night.
Information is a good thing,
I saw Art Blakey only once, and I saw him in the club, and he was a little guy, and he had overalls on, and he looked like he'd come off the train yard or something, man. He was just so down to earth, and spoke with him, he was that way, he's a very genuine, warm person.
I'll send you a photo of the big band where we're all wearing those coveralls. That was one of the uniforms.
Oh, it was? Okay.
Yeah,
so he had a history with that. This would have been in the 70s when I saw him.
There's an album, maybe it's Gypsy Folk Tales or something like that, from the 70s when David Schnitter was in the band, James Williams, and Dennis Irwin, where Art is on the cover of the album in coveralls. I think it started back then. Bobby Watson was in that band too. So,
okay.
And he wore a cowboy hat, so right. Art had some interesting fashion sense. But yeah, what else?
Well, that tempo thing reminded me of I was talking to Max Roach years ago, And I said, Max, did you ever have any trouble making those tempos with Bird and all that? He said, oh, man, we would grunt and sweat and just trying to make it work. He said, and Miles was still alive back then, he said, I just talked to Miles a few weeks ago, and I said, Miles, why did we play that shit so fast? And Miles said, because we could.
Yeah. There you go. There you go. I remember Max saying something about, the only way that he could do that was to break up the time between the different four limbs.
Right. Do you have a secret for that? Some guys think of it in halftime. Like instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, or even, quarter time.
I don't have a secret, but what you just said, Miles' explanation of why they would play the fest, because we could. The thing I've learned about those kind of tempos is you need to play them on a regular basis.
Right.
If you can do that, then you can hang. But if you don't play that tempo or get confronted with a tempo like that, quarter note 300, once every 2 or 3 months, you're going to scuffle. And Art even confirmed that too. But so my sort of theory about that is that those guys were playing 6, 7 nights a week, sometimes matinees on Sunday.
Yeah.
And I think that's how they got to the level to be able to do that. They did it.
It's a good point.
It was regular. Yeah, it was regular, business for them every night. So
I make sure I practice those tempos because you can get hung out to dry when you least expect it. You haven't played that speed in 6 months, and all of a sudden, somebody grates there, and
and they count it off.
I was playing a nothing gig, man. It was like a cigar party or something. And the spokesman for the company, as an endorser kind of, was Christian McBride.
Oh, wow.
So he's at this thing. I said, Christian, you got a cigar endorsement? He said, well, kind of. So, of course, they bring him up to play. And so the leader calls Cherokee. Chris. So that's what I'm saying. You never know. When that night, you're going to be looking at a famous bass player, and they're going to call a tempo like that. And you're either going to make it through it or get your ass handed to you.
Yeah. They call them mixtapes now, right?
Mm-hmm.
Probably like me, you have these cassettes, they're all up-tempo stuff on there, right? And
right.
I used to try to play. Of course, that's like a 45-minute side of a 90-minute tape, which is more extreme than you probably ever have to. But those I found to be kind of preparatory, practice materials.
Well, there's some Oscar Peterson trio stuff without drums. And Monty Alexander had that group Triple Treat without drums. And, they're great to play along with, and the tempos are, really up.
Art actually confirmed that same idea one night when I was the road manager, and we were down in Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, somewhere, I don't remember where. Wynton was still in the band then, but now he was back to a small group, and I was the road manager. But he had some surgery on his feet, like the metatarsals or whatever they are, where, splintered and broken from all those years of stomping on pedals, right?
Wow. And
so he had surgery earlier in the day, and so he said, John, you're going to have to play tonight. And I'm like, okay, So I remember he ended up playing later, but I remember we were playing, and I remember the first break in the dressing room, Wynton would not say these kinds of things very freely. He said, yeah, Ramsey sounds good. Of course, I knew the music because I heard it every night, but Wynton said something like, yeah, Art, Ramsey sounds good tonight, huh? And Art said, yeah, wait till you call some tempo on him. No. Right? Just to say, yeah, he sounds good, in here, ding, 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 call some tempo and see what happens. So yeah.
But I bet you wouldn't trade that experience for anything in the world.
I wouldn't. Some parts of it I would, but not the good parts. No, absolutely.
A few long bus trips and hotels aside, yeah.
Look, if it hadn't been for that, I would have never got the gig at Berklee.
Well, let's talk about Berklee now. So you taught there for many years, and now you're retired. How many years were you there?
38 years.
Just couldn't keep a job, huh? And you saw in those 38 years, it started as, wouldn't you say drum set education began around jazz? Because the instrument kind of grew up that way. And then now you go to Berklee, man, there are experts in all manner of percussion and drums and everything else. It's an amazing school. So what can you describe the changes and the growth in that place over those years?
Absolutely. Well, you raised a good point because the icons of Berklee and jazz education and the founders really of teaching were John Laporta, who was a tenor player. He played with Mingus, and he was one of the first guys, along with Clem DeRosa, to ever have like summer jazz camps and jazz education out on Long Island. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you know Clem; he's a drummer. But
I used to know his son, Rich.
Oh yeah.
He's a drummer.
My roommate when I was at UMass was a Clem DeRosa prodigy. Don Abrams, he played trumpet, but John Laporta, Phil Wilson. These were the guys that were teaching at Berklee in 1982 when I started, and had been there. Yeah, all pioneers of Paul Schmeling was the chair of the piano department. Phil Wilson, John Laporta. Now, the percussion department at that time when I started teaching at Berklee was about 8 to 10 teachers in the percussion department. So actually, the year that I started, there were 3 new teachers. I don't know what was going on that year, but it was me, it was Skip Haddon, and Ed Uribe. And Ed Uribe had just graduated from Berklee, really, and now he went right from being a student to being a teacher. Dean Anderson was the chair then, but he had just recently taken over from Gary Chafee. But
right.
So there was me, there was Ed Uribe, there was Skip Haddon, there was a guy named Ed Kaspick, great polymetric guy, a teacher named Gil Graham. Joe Hunt was on the faculty then, back on the faculty. Who else was there? Bob Kaufman was a teacher, but really about 8 to 10 guys. If you look in Lenny DeMuzio's book, you'll see a photo of the entire percussion department in those days.
I have that.
And
book,
there were probably 200 students, I'm guessing, but we still had principal instruments. We had drum set. Ed Uribe started the hand percussion principal, the Latin percussion program, really, because Ed was, he had those 2 great books on Afro-Cuban and Brazilian drumming.
He was a friend of mine. He passed away a few years ago at a young age. But
I sat in my car and...
What a sweet guy.
I got a phone call from Steve Wilkes one day telling me Ed had passed, and I couldn't get out of the car.
Yeah, it was unexpected.
Ed was, yeah. But anyways, so it's a very small department, but we still had orchestral percussion. Thanks to Ed, we had hand percussion. Giovanni Hidalgo was one of the first teachers for that at Berklee. Yeah. We had marimba principal. We had vibraphone principal. Then they called it total percussion, which was later changed to orchestral percussion because nobody understood what total percussion was, and drum set. So when I left, there were over 40 teachers in the percussion department. And, prior to this pandemic and this recent happenings, there were on average between 650 to 700 percussion students between those, at that point, six principal instruments, because when I was chair, we added steel pan as a principal. So, I mean, the school and the department just grew enormously over the 38 years that I was there. And, of course, there was really 2 buildings pretty much when I started. Now there's probably 20 buildings. And so, I mean, it changed a lot. It really... So I started in 1982. As you said, I just retired this past May. And half of that, my final semester, was, as it is now, all online because of the pandemic. So, I didn't want to go through another semester of that. And as it turned out, the fall semester following, they're still doing online only now. So,
do you teach online at all now?
I have a few private students online. I do Saturday lessons.
Yeah, I teach out here a little bit.
Yeah, I try to keep it small.
Right.
But, I mean, I do either Skype or Facebook sometimes.
Whatever they're on.
Yeah, I did Zoom the last semester at Berklee, but I mean, the place has changed mostly in that it's become so big. Toward the end of my tenure, for many years, the largest department at the college was the guitar department. And that was on average anywhere from 1,000 to 1,200 guitarists, right? So that was a big department, especially when there was only maybe 4,000 students enrolled at the whole school. But that flipped somewhere, what is it now, 2020, maybe around 2010 or thereabouts. It flipped to where the vocal department became the biggest department at the college.
Really?
And and that was like 12 or 1,300 vocalists, right, or more.
Right.
I attribute it to sort of the phenomena of what's it called? The Voice is one show, but what's the big one before that?
American Idol.
American Idol, yeah, and then there was America. So that sort of fed this flourish of vocal.
Could be
American
a confluence of things. There's really not any guitar in pop music anymore,
Yeah.
Well, what a great school, though, I'm sure. Now, I want to ask you about your teaching philosophy, because you and I know that a great teacher it covers more than just the drums, right?
Yes.
It's a mentor. You tell me. I know you're involved with whole people, and I know Carvin was all about that too. Yep.
Well, just as an aside, sort of, one of my most refreshing teacher-student exchanges was, and this answers your question to some degree, is that the first lesson I always, would, of course, and I learned this from guys like John Laporta and Phil Wilson and the elders, right, the Berklee pioneers, really, is that, what's your name? Are you married? Where are you from? Who are you as a person? So I always, and I kept notes, right? They're called spar sheets, but they're student record and data. But I would always ask first, what is it you want to get out of your lesson? Now, that could vary because you had all these different majors at Berklee. You had music production and engineering majors. You had performance majors. You had electronic music majors. You had music ed majors, songwriting majors, jazz composition majors. And the instrument was not always their priority.
Right.
But I think, even that practice, I got that from Alan, because my first lesson with Alan, he was like, well, how can I help you? Mm-hmm. What is it you want to get out of your lesson? So that was always my sort of, framework for any student's lesson. Where do they want to go? What is it I can help you? How can I help you get to where your vision is? And it took me a long time at Berklee to realize that, after maybe 10 years of teaching, because I wasn't a great teacher when I started. I had done some teaching at UMass in the external program, I forget the name of it. But at any rate, it took me the longest time to kind of reconcile that not every kid that came through my door was the instrument and the passion and the prime motive for their education was not always the drum set. And I just, for the longest time, thought anybody that came through my door wanted to know as much as I did about the drums when I was studying, And so I had to kind of tailor that over the years to fit to whatever the kids' goals were. Music production and engineering, they only played an instrument because it was required for 4 semesters. I had guys that would come to their lesson and say, well, the only reason I picked drums is because they're easy.
A lot of people think that, yeah. Yeah, you think so? Here's the sticks.
I want to be an engineer.
Here's the sticks. You show me. Yeah.
And exactly, you would get, believe it or not, at Berklee, you would get guys where that was, how do you hold the sticks? I mean, to this day, that can happen.
Well, I came to these realizations teaching children, and I used to think of it as coaching Little League. How many of those kids are going to play pro ball? Almost certainly none of them, right?
Yep.
But if you do it the right way, how many are going to have their lives enriched? How many are going to learn things about life and being a human being and working with others and setting goals and trying to reach for more? If you do it the right way, everybody benefits from it. And
Absolutely.
It's not up to us to determine what they're going to do, right?
That's right. That's right. That's so true. That I've had students that have gone on to do things totally unrelated to music, but they did it very well. And
But it's still there. They still have that.
Yep. But one of my students, I think it was from South Korea some years ago, came to the first lesson. And after a time, their kids came to me because they knew about me from my book. They knew what I taught, and they'd come to me for that reason. Well, what do you want to study? Well, I want to learn the rudimental ritual or whatever. But this kid came in and very smiling, happy kid. And I said, so I can't remember his name, but so what do you want to get out of your lesson? And he goes, how to have a happy life.
Well, you solve that one, buddy. You can teach me.
You made my day.
Do you remember a movie called New York that Robert De Niro was in?
New York?
Yeah. Not the song. The song came from it, but the movie was about De Niro playing a tenor player. And the guy and they said, what do you want to do? He said, well, I'm looking for my major chord. So what is that? He said, well, it's playing the music I believe in.
Yeah.
Having somebody to share my life with, and making a comfortable living.
Major chord. The triad.
The triad, yeah. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And so many musicians, if you get that out of whack, you got trouble.
Yeah.
So that's part of your teaching, right? It's sort of that's part of being there as a mentor.
I also got that from John LaPorta. I think he talked about musicians who came to him and had this myopic view. All they wanted to do was, study and practice, and he was like, no. Said, you've got to take time out, go for a walk, smell the roses, go out in nature. You're only a musician as much as you're a human being. And, if you're a myopic, one-sided person, and we've all seen this with kids that, that they're tremendous, great players, but, try to talk to them or, they're unhappy people. So, yes, absolutely. I would try to share that as often as I could that, you gotta, there's more to life than drums and music,
Right.
Absolutely.
Well, that's great. Now, what you're dealing with COVID, I know you're not teaching at Berklee anymore, but you're still gigging, I presume, assuming there are gigs again.
Well, there aren't.
I know.
And largely because I think it's the choice of where I live. It's, actually today was the first day that the governor has, what do they call it, step 2 of phase 2 or step 3 of phase 2 reopening the first time since, 6 months now. Now performance venues are allowed to resume. So for this whole time, there's been no gigs.
I know.
And that's the same in New York, I think, for the most part.
Guys that Vegas is closed, Broadway's closed. I mean, Nashville's closed.
But before the pandemic, right where I'm sitting was a drum set, a Gretsch set, and there's a piano over here. And every Monday, I had a session in my living room with Billy Pierce, of Art Blakey, Tony Williams, Stevie Wonder fame, right? My brother, really. Bill Pierce, a great bass player, Greg Ryan, and a great pianist named Consuelo Candelaria. We had sessions in this room every Monday, and it was very challenging music too. I mean, these guys, they're not fooling around. They bring tunes. Of course, Consuelo writes, but Greg brings tunes, and Billy brings tunes that are, I have to work at the place. So that was all happening, and then as soon as the pandemic hit, that came to a crashing halt, and that was, really inspiration to practice again, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm practicing stuff with Billy Higgins on it, and Alan, and Elvin, and so that was that really. I was really still in the game then, but since then it's like no gigs, occasional practice.
It's hard to stay motivated to practice, isn't it?
when you got a gig or a performance, absolutely, that's going to give you the motivation that you might not otherwise have. But now next week I'll be turning 70 years old. I've been playing music and drums for 50 something years. But I mean, going back to what we were just talking about, I enjoy vegetable gardening now. I got a tomato over here I could show you. But, I enjoy fishing. I enjoy working. Now, this house has a 3/4 of an acre, piece of land under it. So there's a lot of, home handyman stuff that needs to be done. So, I mean, I'm happy to do these sort of normal, non-musical things these days. And I find it pleasurable.
You know why? Because you were a happy person before. Happy people are happy people. I'm in the same boat. I'm 65 in December, and I don't know that I'll ever make a living playing the drums again. But I still play. I still love it, and I love my life and my family and all these other interests that are open now.
Yeah. You got kids?
I have a boy who's 37. He's not a boy. Yeah. He used to work with me in the company when I had the cymbal company. He's a guitar player, and he was working like crazy. He was doing chord melody stuff all over town, and now he can't work either. But he's a rock and roll kid.
Well, I'm thinking it's going to come back, and along with that will be gigs and opportunities to play. But I mean, that was really the plan was, to retire and get back to playing.
Right.
That was before we knew about all of this.
Well, it'll still be there. I mean, it'll come back.
Or at least playing more,
Yeah. Right. I don't want to. I used to do 300 gigs a year here in Atlanta, and I don't ever want to do that again. But, there's got to be a happy balance. Anyway, that's probably a good spot to wrap it up. You've been very generous with your time. And
thank you.
I need to hear you play live back when everything gets going again, because
all right.
I haven't had that privilege yet.
I hope we have the opportunity to hear each other.
Yeah. In the meantime, I invite you to come back on the show anytime you want. And next time we get together, when we can, I'll buy you lunch or dinner or beer or something, and we'll hang.
Okay.
Not because I owe you, because I want to.
I'll come back and I'll give you my Ed Soap story next time. But,
okay, all right. Yeah.
Listen. It's a great thing you're doing, and I hope to be able to just sit through and go through the whole catalog at some point. Stay well, and we'll see each other down the road. I hope to hang. And we have our mutual buddy of Terry O'Mahony, right?
Oh, sure, yeah, I saw him online last week.
Andy is like he's like a brother to me. So
who's that?
Andy Zildjian.
Oh, Andy
Z.
Yeah, oh yeah, man. Yeah, Andy saved my ass. I had that company, and I'm so glad I don't have it now.
Yeah.
And Andy bought it, and he's a dear friend, a good guy.
Yep. I love him.
Me too. All right, brother. Thank you so much, and we'll see you on the flip side.
Thank you, Michael. I'm John Ramsey, and I watch Drummer Nation.